Good evening, everyone. Rachel Warner, Tops Nutrition and Fitness Editor. Guess what you're doing with me in my kitchen this evening? We're baking, because it's 'tis the season, right? For our final recipe of the month for December 2025, we are wrapping up our YouTube content for this calendar year with one of the amazing recipes included in our Tops celebration guide. Now, if you are a Tops member, this recipe e-booklet is available for download and viewing through your members portal. If you're not a Tops member yet, then this might be a time to maybe think about joining. We have everything in this booklet from sides, beverages, main entrees, and fabulous desserts like I'm going to show you right now. Now, I'll admit, I've gotten a little bit of a head start so that this video isn't like 40 minutes long, but I'll show you, we're gonna talk about what's included, so the ingredients, healthy substitutions you can make that will help, depending on what your nutritional needs are, especially from a dietary standpoint. So like if you're somebody who is gluten-free, one of the things that it's in the recipe is a cup of flour. So no big deal to swap in a cup of gluten-free flour instead if need be. Even though, again, this recipe is, okay, I don't think I actually have told you what the recipe is yet, right? It's cookies. They are oatmeal, chocolate chip, and walnut. But again, if you're someone, let's say either you or someone else in your household has a nut allergy, then ditch the walnuts, right? These cookies are still delicious with just oatmeal and chocolate chip, I promise you. Okay, so the final substitution I'll mention just right off the bat is one of the things that's called for in the recipe is eggs. So, but you can always use a liquid plant-based egg substitute if someone in your household is vegan, or let's say you have someone coming for the holidays that's vegan, so feel free to use like a liquid substitution for that. You can also use egg whites if you have someone in your household that is trying to keep their cholesterol low. Now, granted, it just calls for one medium egg, but again, those are substitutions to keep in mind if need be. And it should tell you what the ratio is depending on the product that you buy as far as the egg substitute, exactly what the kind of, how to switch it, right? So like, it'll say, maybe like a third of a cup or a fourth of a cup of the plant-based egg or the egg white in exchange for one large egg, something to that effect, right? So check the product that you buy if you're gonna do a substitution for the egg that's included in the recipe. So, like with most desserts, you definitely want to measure everything out. If you're somebody who, like me, if you've watched some of our other YouTube content, oftentimes when I'm making savory recipes, I just kind of eyeball stuff, even though I'll tell you what the actual, what to use, the exact measurement is. But when I'm putting things together, I don't do a whole lot of measuring. I will tell you with baking, you definitely want to measure everything out as it says to. So make sure you follow that to the T. The recipe exactly for this particular one is included in the caption notes to the video. But the main ingredients are, you are going to use oil, right? You are going to use, it calls for soy milk, but again, if you have skim milk in your house, if you have almond milk, go ahead and use what you already have on hand. I definitely want to encourage you to keep this recipe budget friendly. We don't have a ton of ingredients for this one. It's pretty easy to make and put together. So another one of the things that are included is it calls for like a half a teaspoon of vanilla. Now, vanilla, especially liquid vanilla extract, can get pretty pricey. I don't recommend, unless you're going to use this vanilla to make other things like pies and cakes, or maybe some other dishes in your household for the holiday season or for the months to come. I don't recommend going out and buying an entire bottle of liquid vanilla extract just to make this recipe. You can look for dried vanilla. Sometimes that can be a little bit less expensive. The other thing you could do is just, again, it's a half a teaspoon. So if you want to add some complexity to the recipe, think about putting in a little bit of cinnamon or a little bit of nutmeg, right? Using another spice that you already have on hand just to kind of, again, add a little bit more flavor, but without breaking the bank. So again, you got the vanilla. Sugar. I'm a fan of cane sugar, so that's typically what I use when I'm baking. But again, if you have white table sugar already in your house, if you have, I wouldn't recommend necessarily using powdered sugar, but if you have brown sugar, another completely reasonable substitution would be using honey or agave. The only thing is knowing that you wouldn't want to do, if you're going to a liquid sweetener versus like a dried one, I would check again what the ratio of that exchange should be, because, a half a cup or 2/3 of a cup of sugar is definitely not the same as using 2/3 of a cup of honey or agave or a different other type of liquid sweetener. Same thing if you're somebody who's using like stevia, even though that's a dried product, again, I would look it up, make sure that you're keeping those ratios comparable so you don't end up with a cookie that's like crazy sweet or not sweet at all. Okay, so oats, of course, I mentioned oatmeal. Now, A lot of people I know now aren't always a fan of rolled oats. So you can use traditional rolled oats. You could use quick oats. One thing I would say is if you have someone in your household that is gluten sensitive or needs gluten-friendly items, make sure you take the packaging of the oats that you buy to make sure that it actually is. This is true also if you're just buying oatmeal ever, right? And people just assume oftentimes, well, most oats are gluten-free. They are, but sometimes things are processed in facilities with other products so that technically it's not as allergen-friendly as it could be, or you never know. It's just, like I said, it's always a good idea just to check the packaging. So you've got your oats. I mentioned the chocolate chips. It calls for semi-sweet ones. Here we go. Personally, one just fell out. I might have to sneak and just eat that. What do you think? Let's just eat it. You know, we'll sneak peek a little taste. But I'm using dark chocolate chips again because that's what I have on hand. It's actually my personal preference. Do know too, as you're making modifications that might slightly alter the nutritional analysis that's accompanied, with the recipe notes. One more thing I will say is that this also calls for about a half a teaspoon of salt. That is something you completely decide just to leave out, especially if someone in your household has specific like sodium needs or trying to stay on the lower side of things. A half a teaspoon is a lot, but it's still not the same as none. So keep that in mind as well. And then last but not least, the baking soda. Now, if you don't have baking soda, but you have a can of baking powder, think about looking up what that exchange is. Because again, you can use these two things in place of each other, but it's not an exact one-to-one swap. So if it's causing for like a teaspoon of baking soda, look it up and see what that would mean if you're using baking powder instead. So that's pretty much it in terms of recipes. We already talked about as far as the ingredients for this recipe. We've already talked about the walnuts. I'll show you that. You're gonna put all those things together in a bowl. I recommend starting with your liquid ingredients first. So that would be, even though, okay, technically the sugar, unless you're using like a honey or agave, isn't liquid, but it's good to kind of put the sugar, the milk, the egg in first, mix that together, and then you would go in and add in your dried ingredients like the oatmeal, the flour, the baking soda. Then the final kind of creme de la creme, what goes in last is gonna be the nuts if you're using them and your chocolate chips. Okay, so you're gonna mix that all together. One thing I will say too, because this recipe does not have many ingredients, this is something where you should be able to mix it up pretty easily by hand. But if you're someone who has dexterity issues with your hands or mobility issues with your arms, feel free to use like a hand mixer on a low setting. I don't think there's enough ingredients to really justify using like a huge like stand mixer per se, unless you're gonna make like 50 of these. And that would mean then like doubling or tripling. Well, it would be more than doubling. It would be more like tripling or quadrupling this recipe, to be perfectly honest. But so I would recommend either mixing it by hand. You could use a whisk if you didn't want to use a spoon, or like I said, are using like a hand mixer, electronic one, just on a low setting. Okay. So then I'm going to scoop this out so you can see it gets pretty thick. I mean, with the oats, it's a thick batter that you're going to end up with. Also, this is one of those recipes that works so well. If you want to prep it like a day or two beforehand, keep it in the fridge and then bake it. You're going to preheat your oven at 425 Fahrenheit. Now, granted, you might need to adjust like the temp slightly depending on what altitude you're living at. So I live in the Midwest, but if you're someone who lives at a higher altitude or a lower altitude at sea level, you know your oven better than I do. So if it tends to run on the higher side or the lower side, make the adjustments as need be. And then make sure you definitely preheat the oven because you don't want these cookies going in there. If you do decide to refrigerate the batter ahead of time, you might want to take it out on the counter, let it warm up for 5 to 10 minutes, before you, if you essentially refrigerate it overnight, let it warm up for a few minutes before you then scoop it up and put it in the oven. That again has been preheated. So I'm going to scoop out, and then we say to use about a tablespoon. Now, it depends on how thick you want your cookies to be. I also am going to recommend that you flatten them out once you put them on a cookie sheet, because I'm going to show you what the finished product of the first batch of these that I made this time around turned out like. These are they look kind of like breakfast cookies. They're thick, they're a little taller than cookies are. I mean, they're yummy, don't get me wrong. They're super delicious, but they turned out great taste-wise. But if you're looking for more of a traditional flat cookie, then I would say scoop it out, right? Like I just showed you. So that's what your batter. Put it on your cookie sheet and then use the back of the spoon to flatten it, right? You could even use your hand or your fingertips. When you put it on the cookie sheet, spread them out I would say so that they're either 2 fingers or maybe even 3 fingers spread out on the cookie sheet, so there's room for them to spread, especially if you flatten them out. As you can see, I didn't do that the first time, so these ones came out a little thicker, you know, but again, they're delish. I like that. That's not gonna bother me. Trust me, these will get eaten. But again, that's a pro tip for you. Now, I'm gonna take out of the oven right now, right behind me is my oven, the most recent batch that I made, so you can see what a more like, you know, picturesque version of the cookie looks like. So bear with me. Here we go. See? Voila. So that's more of what that looks like when it comes fresh, hot out of the oven. So you can see the difference in diameter and height between this and let's say that cookie right there or that cookie over there. So that's just the way. And I kept a few, I spread out my cookies quite a bit because I know I tend to use a little bit, like my tablespoon scoop is pretty hefty. So that is from A to Z how to make this recipe. Like I said, it goes fast and furious. The cookies only stay in the oven for about 10 to 12 minutes, again, depending on the temp that it's set at and how fast your oven tends to cook. If you decide to try this recipe, please let us know what you think of it, how it turns out. One final thing that is noted in the recipe is that you can take an additional 2 tablespoons of chocolate chips, melt them down, and then add like a finishing drizzle to the top. I will say, just as another final pro tip for this particular video, I would recommend if you're going to do that, take that 2 tablespoons of chocolate chips and mix in a little bit of milk, then put it in the microwave, you know, just for like probably not even a full minute, depending on how high your microwave runs. Because if you try to like melt chocolate chips on the stove and only use 2 tablespoons, it's probably gonna burn. It's really hard to not burn a small amount of chocolate chips like that. Now granted, again, if you're making like a large batch of these cookies and it's gonna be 6 tablespoons of chocolate chips or a whole cup, then you might have an easier time melting them on the stove. But if you're really just doing like a 1 batch of these, then again, like I said, take that 2 tablespoons, add a little milk to it, put it in the microwave, and then you should be good to go. I hope you all have an absolutely wonderful rest of the holiday season and 2025. Please, again, tag us, share, take pictures. If you make these cookies, put it on Facebook and then tag us in it or chat about it on Discord. We're also on Discord. Send us a message. If you have any other questions or ideas, like if you have a holiday recipe that you love and you're looking like, how can I make this just a little more like wellness centered? You know, is there a way to, you know, still have this turn out fantastic, but use less sugar or use less oil? Let us know. You know, that's what we're here for. We love just being here to support people and giving any tips we can. Check us out on Instagram too. So if you're on social media, it's always worth checking us out because we're on a lot of the platforms. We look forward to seeing you in January with new amazing recipes for 2026 and workouts. Because again, after you make these cookies, if you're like, hey, like now that it's January, I want to think more about like fitness in regard and conjunction with my nutritional goals. You know, check out our YouTube shorts because there's tons of like already wellness and fitness movement centered content on our shorts page. So we're here for you. Any time of day or night, you can access us online and we will see you next year.